What's up, everybody, and welcome back to my studio. I'm Joseph Finchum, and let's get into this. Today, we're finishing off this dahlia flower in water-soluble graphites. So getting right into this video, I'm going to cover the laying in of details and values for this dahlia flower. As you can see, I've already done my lighter values and blended them out with a little dihydrogen monoxide. If you didn't see the process of that, you can click on the info card above, and that'll bring you to the first two videos, and I think you should watch those first. I did the lighter values and the blending first because that is how I taught myself to use graphite. I have always found it easier to lay down my lighter values first, because that helps fill in the tooth of the paper. If you want to leave any part of the paper white, do not touch the paper with the pencil. Leave it as white as you can, as long as you can. I found over the years that if you don't do this, and you go to the darker values, you tend to end up with a more grainy look in the finished product. So leaving the paper completely light, where there will be any color at all, is a bad idea. And laying down even your lightest color of graphite will help reduce that grainy look in the finished product. And that'll make it look 100% better than if you did nothing at all. After blending, which I did in the last video, you have to remember to give the paper time to dry before moving back to your pencils. If you don't, you're going to damage your paper. About 10 minutes is usually enough time, so drying assistance is not really needed. But if you were using them more like graphite paint, a longer amount of time or a hairdryer might be worth it. I did, however, leave a lot of the white of the paper showing for a good portion of this flower drawing. If this had been a colored pencil piece or an acrylic painting, and it was being done in full color, then most of the spots wouldn't even be white. The very light highlights would have been a yellow color, because the majority of the flower is actually in the orange range of colors. The darkest sections of the flower would have been an almost burgundy reddish color, instead of mostly dark black. And the darkness of the leaves, of course, would have been in the range of greens. Since I was doing this in graphite, I figured that making the reference photo pure black and white beforehand was probably a good idea. I mean, if you're gonna do a black and white graphite pencil drawing, you really should change it to black and white before you even start. If you're not doing this, it could cause you some problems. I should mention here somewhere that I'm not using straight tap water. You probably could, but it's not recommended. Some people will use distilled water. I'm not using distilled water either. I actually filter my tap water through a filter I have for hiking, but it removes about 99.9% of any undissolved minerals that may be in the water, as well as most of the chemicals that may be in your water. It's not going to be perfectly distilled, but for me, I find that it works pretty good, and that in itself is good enough for me. This flower has a ton of depth to it, and you can probably see in the photo that was attached to the last video just how much each layer of petals is overlapping and casting a shadow on the layer of petals below it. I really wanted to capture the depth of field in the photo. It's really important to get your values correct as you're going in order to make sure you get that 3D look to the petals as you go. Now, of course, I'm not going for picture-perfect realism here. I'm actually just trying to make it look as much like the flower as I can, because I want people to understand that it is in fact a drawing and not a photograph. But if your values and layers are not done properly, it just isn't going to have that 3D look, and it's going to be very flat, and we don't want that. I'd say this drawing took me approximately 8 to 10 hours to finish in its entirety. That's 8 to 10 hours of actual drawing time, though. I probably spent about 15 to 20 hours just looking at the reference photo. I had been given advice years ago that when you're doing any drawing, you should spend more time looking at your reference photo than you do at your drawing itself. And for the most part, that has worked for me in the past, and up to the present. I should probably take just a moment to remind everyone that this is, again, my first time using these water-soluble graphite pencils. I've been using graphite pencils for years, but these are a completely new media for me to work with. I've also used watercolors before, and I've dabbled with the Inktense blocks, so I understand how watery wet media work, and that really helped in using these. I did, however, use these pencils mostly as a dry media. I only used water in the initial blending and a few tests on the petals after I had filled them in, which I really didn't like that much. They went really dark really fast, and I wasn't into that. Other artists who have made videos about these water-soluble graphite pencils have said that they find them faster than using normal graphites. But I actually found it a little bit slower. But this could only be because it was my first time using them. I found myself spending more time thinking about where, how, and what I was going to be blending later, and that seemed to be slowing down the process in which I have taught myself to use graphite pencils. I'm sure that if I use them a bit more, I'll probably be able to figure out some more of the tips and tricks that help you overcome the time loss from thinking about the blending, because it'll be easier if you know what needs to be blended and when. As I just mentioned, there are a few spots where you really need to go from a darkest dark with a gradient to a very light in a tiny amount of space in the petals of this flower. This is one of the reasons why I decided against actually blending out the final layers. I'm sure with a little more experience, I won't hesitate to blend it out in future projects. As I work on an individual petal or a group of petals, you can see that I'm starting to sharpen my lines and edges in order to get a very concise and definitive line to my details. Still continuing to refine the overall shapes and where the highlights and edges of every petal and shadow fall on the flower. I like to be pretty exact with how I put down my different values of graphite, and because of that, I hold the pencils in what some might consider a peculiar way, but some of you may do this yourselves. I hold them in my hand, light to dark and left to right, because this has become a trained habit. I never really have to think about which pencil I'm grabbing. I'll pop a picture up on the screen in a second to show you exactly how I hold them. I'd say it probably took me about 3 to 4 months and about 10 drawings in total, many, many years ago, to train myself to hold them this way and make it a habit. In the picture, you might notice that the HB and the 2B pencils are in the same location in my hand, and this makes them interchangeable without much thought. If I'm using a wider range of values, say 4H through 8B, plus a really black charcoal, I hold them in pretty much the same setup, but also add one pencil to each position, and usually my 3 lightest values under my thumb. You might not think this would be a comfortable way to hold them, but for me, it works. And as an added bonus, you get to feel like Freddy Krueger or Edward Scissorhands for a couple of minutes. I said in the last video that I wanted to stick to using the core set of these pencils that I received, which was the 4H through 8B pencils and the one pointed liner brush, although it might be a little too wide to be considered a liner brush. I have a few brushes I would probably use instead going forward, but to begin with, I wanted to use just what they gave me. I usually try and give the product maker the benefit of the doubt that they know what should be used with their products, but I myself would prefer a slightly more stiff brush than the one they include. As I said earlier, there's a dark spot on the right side of the flower. This is where I tested the water blending, but I felt it just got too dark. And I tried to lift some of the dark graphite out of it the best I could, but it could only pull up just so much with using the water. If I had tried to erase it, maybe I could have pulled up a little bit more, but I don't know. Chalk it up to a learning experience and move on. That's all you can do, right? If you took a good look at the reference photo from the beginning or thumbnail of my last video, part 2, you may have noticed that the leaves are not there, or just way out of focus, making them pretty much useless overall. Since I snapped a ton of pictures, I had a few that had some good leaf shots in them. I felt that the flower by itself just didn't have enough contrast to make it really stand out. That's why I decided to add the leaves that I did. It's never a bad idea to add, subtract, or change the drawing if you believe it will improve the overall composition. Every now and then you'll see that I tend to jump around, and that's because you start to get some parts of the drawing looking the way you want them. You may notice that it kind of throws off another part from looking the way it should, and so I'll jump over there to try and make a quick correction in the values before going back to the part I was working on previously. Sometimes there's also a sort of chain reaction effect going on, where you'll jump to another spot, and then another, because things keep looking slightly off as you modify each part you work on. The last step to this drawing is, of course, placing in the leaves. I've had them outlined since the very beginning, but I'm just now starting on them. I didn't want to risk putting down all that dark graphite and then accidentally smudging it all over the white of the paper with my hand. I did use glassine throughout most of this to protect the paper and the drawing from my hand, but you never know when mistakes might happen. I filled them all in with my lightest color of graphite and then blend them out with the water as intended. This is just to give me my base value. I left a dark outline everywhere the flower overlaps the leaf because those are the darkest area of the leaves due to the shadows. The leaves of the flower itself are a dark green, and only the top left leaf really has any form of reflection to it. I then start to add in the veins and the cells of the leaves, and this is really what makes them come to life. This is the most tedious part of the drawing, but it's well worth it if you really want it to look like you gave it your best shot. I've often told people how I hide stuff in my drawings, and for this drawing, I'm going to point out just one of the 5 symbols that I hid in this drawing. If you take a very close look at the leaf that is at the bottom of the flower towards the bottom of the screen, you may notice a normal EKG reading hiding out in the veins of that leaf. This is a little shout out to my sister, who's a nurse. The last and final, true final step was to take some graphite and rub it onto a separate piece of paper so that I could use it with some water as a light, almost graphite paint. I used this method to add in a drop shadow around the entire shadow casting edge for just a little bit more depth. Well, that about sums up this drawing. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope I filled in some of the gaps of what you might know or not know about graphite pencils. And I hope you'll come back and check out more videos as time goes on. Thanks for watching. Bye.